welcome to our first natural family planning discussions. And we have a wonderful pioneer for within the natural family planning community. I'm so delighted to introduce Dr. Sister Hanna Klaus. Hanna, we have known each other for years. I should say I am Theresa Notare. I'm presuming that many of you know me as well. I direct the Natural Family Planning Program of the Bishops' Conference here in Washington, D.C. And as I said, I'm kind of gushing because Hanna is one of my heroes. And Hanna, why don't you just tell us about yourself?
Well, I am a medical mission sister. I'm also an obstetrician gynecologist. And I got involved with natural family planning when I came back from 7 rather intense years in Pakistan, where I delivered a lot of babies, did a lot of GYN surgery, and also some other things that needed to be done, and became aware of the need for family planning. I came back in 1968 from Dhaka in September, and Humane Vitae had been issued in July the 22nd that year. And I read it, and I said, well, that's very nice, Holy Father. You've told us what we can't do, but you haven't told us what we can do. So I returned to my teaching hospital, which was Washington University in St. Louis, and worked on the faculty. Then the chairman retired, and his replacement was a very enthusiastic abortionist. So I went across town to the Jesuit Medical School and was hired on the faculty there. And while I was there, Cardinal Carberry sent around a little booklet by John and Lynn Billings, which had been issued in Los Angeles by Monsignor Deegan from the Department of Health and Hospitals. And it was a whole lot, not nearly as nice and concise and specific as we have come to see now, but nevertheless, it made sense to me. So for the first time, I could see there was something that you could do. Because as an obstetrician gynecologist, of course, you know, a lot of women came and wanted to have help in spacing children. And that was totally legitimate, but until then, the only thing that was available was the IUD and then the pill. And that was clearly not what fitted with the rest of our.
Well, can I stop you a second and just pause and say, before Humane Vitae came out, what was typical of how you treated patients as a sister and a gynecologist to boot? What was normal for your day and age?
Well, the only thing that was really available were male condoms and diaphragms or jellies. And frankly, and tubal ligation. Mm-hmm. And about the only interaction I had was when I was still a resident, and I would have to get people to sign permissions for the ligation. And even just on a human basis, I always had questions about it. I wondered if these women really knew what they were doing. It turned out many times that they didn't. They thought, you know, it was like tying a shoelace. Yeah. You could tie it, you could untie it.
So you did, I'm sorry to interrupt. So you did have moral reservations at that time when that?
Well, I was a fairly recent convert to the Catholic Church at that point. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have all of the rationale, but when I became a Catholic, I bought the whole picture. So, you know, there was wisdom there that I might not have been able to spell out. I could do a lot more now, but just on a basis that the patients that we had in our hospital at Barnes, obviously they were ward patients, they were poor if they were asking to have their tubes tied. And many of them, you know, I would ask them, well, what about your husband or your partner? Would he consider vasectomy? It's much less of an operation. Oh, no, he wouldn't. I said, well, what's he going to think of you? You know? So
Wow.
many of the women thought, well, maybe that's not such a good idea after all. Just, one of the things I've come to see over the years, before we get into details, is that contraception is not women's liberation. It's men's liberation.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And the poor women who don't see it. Anyway,
Yeah.
going
Well,
back to the beginning.
then uh, when you became Catholic, if you don't mind, I would like to go back to that. It sounds like it was pretty difficult as a convert when you first realized the teachings of the church. Do you remember what your first thoughts were? How did you react to that?
Well, the whole journey into the church was such a profound thing. When you get right down to it, I had to know who God was before I knew who I was.
Sure.
So you had to get things into perspective. But at the time, I was in pathology, so the whole teaching on birth control really was not something that worried me at that point, because I was dealing with autopsies and surgical specimens and bacteria and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So, but then when I realized that pathology was not really my thing, and I switched to OBGYN, then of course it became very obvious. And in my application to Barnes Hospital, I made it clear that I would not participate in tubal ligations. And as far as contraception was concerned, there was a Wednesday afternoon clinic where Dr. Stewart fitted diaphragms. I went to see what she was doing once just so that I would know. But the rest of the time, it was just not a burning issue.
Sure, sure. Well, can you walk us through how you discovered the Billings method and when you met the Billings? Because I'm sure that must have been life-changing.
It certainly was. Cardinal Carberry sent Dr. Billings' book around to all of the Catholic doctors in St. Louis, and I read it. I'm afraid many of them just tossed it in the wastebasket, but I didn't. And I had a wonderful, charismatic couple. Nancy was carrying her 5th child, and they wanted to have some space. So after the baby was born, Nancy, her husband, and I sat down with the Billings book, and we literally prayed and cursed our way through that whole first book. It was so, it was new to all of us. And even though I obviously knew about ovulation and I knew about estrogen and progesterone, it was the only thing that was stressed to us really was pathology, and not physiology,
Right, right.
So we had to learn the whole thing. That was in 72, and in spring of 73, I had been to a meeting in Washington for something else, and Larry Kane, who was the executive director of the Human Life Foundation, said,
right, that's Mary Kay Williams, right?
Yes, Mary Kay, yeah, she's still around. I'm afraid Larry's gone home to his eternal reward. The Human Life Foundation, incidentally, was a bequest that Cardinal O'Boyle had gotten. You know his history there. There were priests right away who objected to Humanae Vitae. The next day it was published, I think. It was published on the 22nd of July, and on the 23rd they already had the statement condemning it. Well, Cardinal O'Boyle had no time for that, and he called them in and so forth. And as a result of that, he persuaded the conference to set aside, I think, $1 million to start the Human Life Foundation. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I met Larry Kane, and he suggested I meet Mercedes Wilson, who she came through St. Louis at that time, and gave us a very simple presentation on the Billings method. She had been in Australia and met the Billings and had applied it in her own life. And it was like lighting a light in a dark storeroom and not falling over the furniture anymore. She just made it very simple and very understandable, and suggested that I go to Sydney, which the first meeting of the Billings people. And And there were several hundred couples there. The meeting was in the basement of St. Margaret's Hospital, and they had charts tied to every pole in that basement. And I thought, well, these were walking statistics. These couples obviously were doing this and they were happy with it. Because at that time, there was very little in the way of documentation. One article in Australia and one article in the Lancet in '72, which gave the physiological basis for the first time. John and Lynn Billings had Harry Berger and Jim Brown. And anyway, so I listened, learned a lot, and went back to St. Louis and suddenly realized that I was the authority on the Billings method and that Australia was 10,000 miles away. And in those days, long distance calls were expensive.
Oh, they were very expensive.
So, you know, you couldn't just pick up the phone and ask questions. And there was no such a thing as email. Letter mail took quite a long time, etc. But somehow we managed to start what we called the Aware Center. It had been a crisis pregnancy center and they moved. And so we fell heir to their quarters. And one of the women who was a professional teacher became the instructor, and the rest of us all learned. And a lot of people came, actually. The first time we had a class, we had 18 women. And 17 heard everything we said correctly, and the 18th heard it completely backwards. And when she came to follow up, God bless her, she thought the days on which she put her white stamps for the baby were the days to use if you wanted to avoid pregnancy. And the only thing she had heard correctly was, don't do anything until you come to follow up. So we managed to get that unscrambled. And she had what the auditory form of dyslexia. She heard things backwards. So that taught me early on the importance of follow-up.
Right.
No matter what you say, get the client to tell you back what you said. Make sure you got it right.
So when you were beginning, the Billings didn't really give you a syllabus or a way to teach?
Well, there were a number of things presented at this conference, but there was no syllabus in that.
Right.
There was just that little book. All of those things came later. This really was something being begun. John had started actually in '52, and this was '73.
Right.
So, and Lynn was the one who really developed the simple teaching method, which was today what we call it experiential learning. Ask a woman to write down what she feels and sees, and then we'll interpret it. And that's still the best way to teach.
Right.
Anyway, after this meeting, I flew to Melbourne and stayed in the hospital where John was the dean of the School of Neurology of all things, and learned how to teach from Lynn, and learned after follow-up from Kath Smythe, who was doing also the urine assays for Dr. Brown.
And Dr. Brown worked closely with
Jim
Dr.
Brown was
Billings.
the man who had done most of the estrogen chemistry when he was getting his doctorate in Scotland, and was then head of the laboratory at the Royal Women's Hospital. And he had done all of the hormonal backup of the Billings.
Oh, wow.
Which was fantastic. Later on, when Jim came to talk to us at St. Louis U, where I was on faculty, he said, I'm a Presbyterian. I don't have to use this method, but it's the best method there is. So,
well, how soon did big wigs at like the World Health Organization, when did they start noticing the work of the Billings?
By 76 or 77, when one of the two, there was a meeting in Geneva on the determination of the fertile phase, because John Marshall, who was in England, had done a lot of work with the symptothermal method. So the Billings method was not the first attempt at natural family planning, but you know, the thermometer the temperature rises 3 days after ovulation. And then you know you're in the post-ovulatory infertile phase. But it was really the contribution of John Billings and also Joseph Retzer, who worked independently, also started in 52, who recognized the importance of the mucus. Because obviously, the gist of the method is that when estrogen has risen to the point where it starts the flow of mucus from the cervix, ovulation is imminent. And from then on, any sperm that are alive in the mucus will stay alive until ovulation. So that's the Billings method is purely prospective. Dr. Retzer kept the calendar calculation and also the cervical palpation and the temperature, but he did give serious consideration to the mucus. It took some other folk. Sorry.
Do you know if Dr. Retzer and the Billings, if they quickly met each other and started working together?
Yes, actually there was a meeting at Airlie House in suburban rural Virginia near the Washington, but Larry Kane had gotten going, and there were a number of people there. This was before I arrived on their scene, and both Retzer and Billings were there, as well as some other people from NIH. And it was a high-level scientific meeting. But then going back to your question about the WHO, there was a task force for the determination of the fertile phase that Jeff Spieler ran, and I was a member of that, as was Lynn Billings and Claude Langto, who had the International Federation for Natural Family Planning by that time. That grew out of the Airlie House meeting. So a lot of things came about rather quickly at that time. Mm-hmm. And then the WHO initiated a study of the Billings method in 5 countries, and so on and so forth.
Well, with all that high-level activity going on, Hanna, when did you simultaneously start realizing you had to bring it to the level of the couples? How did you organize yourself? Who were the people you gathered around you to help you get that job done?
Well, they came, you know, and the Lord brings people to you. There were a lot of people who thought this was important. And I think just the fact that we knew how to do it, a lot of people came. So I didn't go out looking for them. They were looking for this already. It was the Holy Spirit leading people. First of all, many Catholic women didn't really want to use the pill because they knew that contraception was wrong. So they were happy to have something that wasn't contradicting their faith. And also there were side effects.
Right.
The earlier pills had a much higher dosage than the later ones, but none of the pills are innocuous, even today. But going back to the beginning, from St. Louis, we were asked to come and start other programs in Joliet, Illinois, and Lincoln, Nebraska. And then when I moved to Wichita from St. Louis, of course, we started in Kansas City, St. Joseph. The Bishop of Kansas City, Bishop Helmsing, I had known him in another context. So he invited me to come. He gathered a bunch of doctors in his living room. And the funny part about it is the only one who was really convinced was a Mormon bishop. The young guy who was a Catholic, he was just sure that this was no good, and blasted and all, but it's been like that. Anyhow. So anyway, there was another meeting in Melbourne in '78, and many more of us were there. And that's when John Billings asked me to start looking at the young people, because nobody was doing that. So that was the beginning of Teen Star. there were enough other people working with the Billings method. I continued, we always taught in our parish every week and so on and so forth. But the big effort was becoming the effort on Teen Star, which required research to begin with to make sure that what we were doing wasn't going to cause an epidemic of teen pregnancy, which it didn't, and so on and so forth, and all the implications. So one of your questions was, did we have any NFP heroes? Well, I think John and Lynn, without a doubt. They were such wonderful people. I love the story that John told many years later in Rome at one of our meetings. Lynn was a trained pediatrician and excuse me, gotten their children to the point where she could go back to work. And so she pretty soon saw a child in the newborn nursery way back against the back wall. Well, why was she there? Well, she was a preemie and she was born at that point called to an unwed mother. Now we would say a single parent, but anyway, she was supposed to be adopted. And because she was weakly, they decided to build her up with some fluids. And instead of putting the needle into the vein, they put it in the artery, and the whole forearm became sloughed. So this poor child had only one functioning hand from the elbow down on the left side that had been amputated. And at that time in Australia, no child could be adopted if he was not physically and mentally intact. And so Lynn said, well, we have so many hands in our house. They already had 6 children, including a set of twins. But she said, one more, we couldn't do that. So she called John, and he went and said to the children, Mommy wants to bring another child home. But if she does, we won't be able to buy a TV set, and you'll all have to help Mommy. And he said, I was so proud of the children. They all said, bring the baby. Well, the first time I was in Melbourne, I met Catherine, and she was 14. And Catherine was clearing the dishes. And she had this whole stack on her left arm. And she got to the kitchen with it, and you heard this resounding crash. And Lynn, in the sweetest voice you could imagine, just said, oh, sweetheart, you just took one too many. I thought, what a wonderful woman.
They were remarkable, both
They
of them.
were. The last time I saw Lynn, we had been to the Eucharistic Congress in Sydney. I think it was in 2002. And I felt that Pope Benedict wouldn't miss me. So I took a plane and went down to Melbourne to see Lynn. John had already gone home to his eternal reward. And at that time, I met Catherine, the one who had been adopted. And the story was that Catherine, she had married, and her mother-in-law had said to her, well, now that we have open adoption, you can find out who your real mother is. And Catherine said, I know who my real mother was. So that's a wonderful story about the village.
It really is a beautiful story. In thinking about your work, I mean, you had been leading the Billings Ovulation teachers in the United States. Gosh, ever since that I started working at
Well, but before you came on board, Theresa, Mercedes had organized them. But then there were some issues which I can't fully understand. But anyhow, she went on to other things.
Yeah.
And so Margaret Magali, who had worked with us on the Aware Center in St. Louis and who had been the president of WOOL USA, she gave me the list of teachers, and we reorganized as Billings Ovulation Method of the US and got that started. They were part of our board for a while. But then I managed to get Kay Eck to take it over, and she did a wonderful job of separating it, because I had really, as much as Sister Ursula, my dear colleague, and who was also a medical mission sister, the two of us were doing Teen Star with not too many other people. And it was going quite well. Already, one year we had 8 workshops. And a workshop was 35 hours. So, we were busy.
Right, right.
And
I think I'm going to be hopefully talking with hopefully Mercedes or her current executive director of Family of the Americas. I know that at one point she became more focused on international natural family planning education. Because
yes, and she had gotten a grant from USAID
right,
and invited people from a number of African countries, especially,
right,
maybe others also,
yeah,
to train
exactly.
them to become trainers. So that seemed to have been her big focus for a while.
Yes, yeah, you know, she still has that international focus. She's one of the few programs that has so many teaching materials in multiple languages. So it really is remarkable. But then getting back to your work with Team Star, you brought in quite a few experts, didn't you, to help you develop that curriculum?
Well, from the very beginning, Mary Lou Bryant and her husband, they were in my first class for Billings in Louisville, Kentucky. Well, Mary Lou was a very gifted school teacher. So when we got our grant from the Kennedy Foundation, she was one of the people whom I asked to do one of the pioneer groups, one of the pilot groups. And I had this very medical outline, and Mary Lou said, that's not how kids' brains work. And so she tossed that one. She went into her classroom, and in her best Southern accent, she said, y'all want to talk woman talk? And that became the Teen Star curriculum in the sequence in which the kids asked the questions. And the first thing they said is, what's that stuff that comes out? Well, that stuff is the mucus. So first they had to recognize it and to see, that it wasn't the same every day, and then why wasn't it the same every day, and where did it come from? And that was Teen Star. And then, of course, we had to look and see what the hormones did in terms of your feelings. And then you dealt with the feelings, which came with estrogen and progesterone. And what did it make you do in terms of relationships? And we were fortunate, we always kept track not only of the physical, but also of what they were doing, what their behavior was. And we found that it really supported remaining abstinent or returning to abstinence.
Mhm.
There are not a number of sexuality education programs for adolescents in this country, and some of them were able to support remaining abstinent, but we're the only ones who could demonstrate return to abstinence, even among those who were already involved. So I think that's one of the wonderful things of coming to terms with your fertility and seeing what it does to you as a person. And the funny thing is, the men had almost identical statistical data.
Wow.
They don't have a cycle, but they had to come to understand about their bodies and what to do with it. Unfortunately, the culture is not exactly supportive of that.
Yeah.
But we choose to be countercultural because part of being human is being free. And you're not free if you have to say yes to everything that crosses your mind.
That's true.
You have to be able to make decisions,
Right.
to know what's appropriate and what isn't.
So let's do one more question right now before we take a break.
Okay.
In looking at your work that you've been doing all of your life, can you identify your greatest achievement? Do you even think like that?
Goodness, I guess it's a Teen Star program, but it's not mine, it's ours. There's so many of us involved.
Right. Right.
So ultimately, the most wonderful gift is finding the love. Everything else is added onto it.
Thank you, Hannah. Let's take a break now.
Okay.